Hi, Brad.
Hello, Brink.
How are you doing?
We're in California. We're planning to move, so there's enormous chaos around here.
But
rather less chaos in this house, I must say, than there is in Washington, D.C. and in the general governance structure of the country.
What a fine segue. Before we get going, let's introduce ourselves to Blogging Heads viewers. I'm Brink Lindsey from the Kauffman Foundation.
And I'm Brad DeLong from the University of California at Berkeley.
So let's dive right in then to the big debt ceiling deal that was struck and now has passed both houses of Congress. Why don't you lead off? Why don't you tell me what you think of this deal and compare it to realistic alternatives, and we'll go from there.
Well, let me say you can look at this from any of four aspects. You can look at it from the economics aspect. You can look at it from the kind of long-run role of the state in the mixed economy aspect. You can look at it from the governance aspect, or you can look at it from the political aspect. Let me start with the economics aspect.
Yep.
And then we may segue into any of the other three later on. The first thing to note is that this is a bill that makes big promises for the next 10 years. This is a bill that imposes relatively sharp, long-run reductions in that one part of the government, non-defense discretionary spending, that actually hasn't grown substantially over the past decade and a half. And reduces those spending levels to levels per capita and that haven't been seen in quite a while, and that Congress has previously turned down lots of invitations to push those spending levels down to.
Yes.
So what the deal says will happen in years 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that really depends on politics. It's not even the case that what's done now creates a secure baseline against which the inertia of the system has to work hard to move the government off of its spending projection. We, back in the Clinton administration, we had big plans and promises in 1998 and 1999 too. Right? We had the country on a trajectory whereby we were going to pay off the national debt by 2010 or so, and build up this enormous Social Security surplus that was then going to help ease the transition to the retirement of the baby boomers and give us the wiggle room and the grease to actually make a serious reform of Medicare so that its spending didn't grow as far.
Right.
Yet the politics changes, well, in November 2010, or rather in January 2010, when George W. Bush is installed by a vote of 5-4. And all of that gets completely swept off the table. It's highly likely that whatever's agreed now is not going to play a big impact in what happens in 2013 and 2014. So most of the effect of this will be 2011 and 2012.
Yeah, I just want to chime in and say I think this is an enormously important point. When these deals are announced, when any kind of legislation like this is announced that has a 10-year time frame, it's always presented as if this is carved in stone and that these numbers are real, when in fact, after next year and the year after, what's being promised here is just promises, and promises are frequently empty in Washington and frequently overturned by subsequent political factors. So,
especially as the promises are promises that some future group of senators and representatives will do something.
Right, which they lack the authority to bind those people's hands. So
they can't even promise that future senators and representatives will obey the rules of debate and discussion that they're laying down today.
Now, here you sound in sort of downplaying the significance of the longer term aspects of this deal. You sound significantly calmer than you did on your blog yesterday when you were forecasting a double-dip recession on the basis of this deal.
Well, so that's the short term, right?
But the short term is only, $22 billion in cuts in fiscal year 2012?
It's a little bit more than that, and it's also a horrendous waste of opportunity.
Okay,
that at the moment the Recovery Act is unwinding.
Yeah.
And adding in conventional multipliers, the unwinding of the Recovery Act is putting about 0.75 percentage point of downward pressure on economic growth in the United States right now. States and localities are about to begin another big round of budget cuts, and that's going to put another 0.75 percentage point of downward pressure on economic growth for the next year or two. So that's 1.5% of GDP growth of headwinds. And now we've just added another 0.3 percentage points of headwinds, according to macroeconomic advisors. That gets us up to 1.8. And then if the Super Congress doesn't come up with a plan that actually passes come the end of this year, and
right.
if they then, if the automatic cuts then aren't suspended, then we hit the economy on the head with a hammer in fiscal 2013. The recovery is very weak already.
Yes.
That is, consumers are quite rationally saying, Jesus, my housing equity is gone. I need to build up some wealth. I need to cut my spending back below my income. Tim Geithner continues to say that a strong dollar is in America's interest, while people in China think a weak renminbi and people in Europe think a weak euro or pound is in their interest. That means our exports are unlikely to grow. Government purchases are contracting. And on investment spending, business investment in equipment and software is actually quite healthy. But construction is still absolutely
on its back, yes, right.
That amount of fiscal contraction is kind of likely to push us over the edge from unsatisfactory expansion into a double dip. I'd say the odds now are 50-50. And of course, once you start down again, expectations and psychology change, and you could go down quite a way. I wouldn't say a double dip is inevitable now. It's as likely as not.
Yeah. Of course, I agree with you that the economy is in weak shape, and the recent revisions in the GDP figures make things look even grimmer than they had looked. And yes, the direction of fiscal policy is not in a contractionary direction. I hesitate to dive too deeply into this because although I write about economics policy, I'm not a professional economist, and I regard the whole field of macroeconomics.
You certainly play one. Not just
I play one on TV from time to time,
and in the public intellectual sphere.
Yeah, so I said I write about economic policy, but not as a professional economist, and I will certainly add all kinds of caveats to my opinions about macroeconomics, where I think knowledge in general remains fairly meager.
Extremely meager.
Yeah. But I will say that I don't put a lot of faith in fiscal policy to do too much to stimulate the economy. And in your rundown of the factors that militate in favor of a double dip, you did not mention the Fed. I would say that the Fed moves last in all of these matters, and that it is unlikely to stand idly by and watch the economy crater. I'm sufficiently persuaded by the writings of Scott Sumner on monetary policy to believe that monetary policy remains contractionary currently, as evidenced by the fact that nominal GDP is way off trend, and that the Fed retains all kinds of things in its arsenal it could be doing but isn't because of political factors. But those political factors will change if the economy really falls through a hole in the ground. The Fed remains the cavalry that can come to the rescue and at least prevent a real wholesale collapse.
Yeah, the Fed remains the cavalry that can come to the rescue. But I think you've got to recognize that in Scott Sumner's mind, a neutral monetary policy now involves the Federal Reserve doing twice as much as it was doing in quantitative easing and doing it every month.
Yep.
Involves the Fed expanding its balance sheet by $200 billion a month, buying $200 billion of bonds and printing $200 billion a month of money, until the private sector is so awash with liquid assets and has had so much risk taken off its balance sheet that they're willing to say that even though the future doesn't look bleak, they might as well spend on something rather than sit on piles of cash slowly being eaten away by inflation. And so Sumner's idea of a neutral monetary policy, the people on the FOMC regard as extraordinarily bold, extraordinarily dangerous, and pushing the envelope, moving them from decisions that are technocratic, technical, and monetary to decisions that really ought to be made by the people's elected representatives. And I saw this back in September, October of 2008. There was actually no requirement to pass the Troubled Asset Relief Program, the TARP, at all. The Federal Reserve could have used Section, 13.3, exigent circumstances, to do 3 TARPs overnight, if it wished. But the view in the Federal Reserve was that this is a big enough decision that the people's elected representatives have to sign off on it. And it should go through the normal legislature and executive rather than go through a particular technocratic entity that simply has some delegated powers. And that seems to be a powerful thing constraining Fed actions now, that they don't want to be bold, aggressive, pushing the envelope, grabbing authority from Congress and the executive. So I'm much more pessimistic about what the Fed would do with the economy.
I agree with you. I agree that political factors are certainly constraining the Fed from doing what it could be doing. And so in the 1990s, you have Professor Ben Bernanke scolding the Bank of Japan for not doing precisely what the Fed is not doing now. And so I think technically the Fed has lots in its arsenal that it could be deploying to rev up the economy. It's not doing them because assuming that role is well out of the mainstream of expectations for what the Fed ought to be doing, and certainly at great variance with important members of the FOMC who are inflation hawks and thinking inflation is around the corner. So the Fed is constrained politically, but not technically. However, if the economy really looks like it's nosediving, I would imagine that those political constraints will relax.
I imagine those political constraints relaxed if unemployment got and stayed above 7%. Right?
Yeah. No.
That is.
Fair enough.
Right now we have that we actually have a smaller proportion of our adult population at work now than we had at the worst point for the unemployment rate.
Yep.
That when Ben Bernanke and Barack Obama tell you that the unemployment rate has fallen 0.9 percentage points since the worst days, what they don't say is that none of that is because a greater proportion of adults are at work. And all of that is because a bunch of people dropped out of the labor force. So you say if the labor force were behaving, quote, normally, unquote, our unemployment rate now would be pushing 11%. If you told me that we could have that high an unemployment rate with no prospects for a rapid 1983-84 Reagan-style decline in it at any time in the future, in the near future, that the political system would proceed to obsess about long-run deficits for 6 months. I wouldn't have believed it if you told me this was coming back in 2007. So I'm inclined to doubt your forecast that a cratering economy would produce a more aggressive Fed. Instead, it would be more likely to produce a more partisan and divided public debate with a bunch of people saying the only true salvation is to go back to the gold standard, and a bunch of other people to say you were not called Helicopter Ben for no reason. And in those circumstances, you'd have to have a very aggressive central bank chair indeed to say, I'm going to push the envelope of my powers.
Well, we do have a track record of this Fed doing novel and aggressive things in the face of looming economic catastrophe. So
Right.
So it could happen again. But the main point here, which I think is worth reemphasizing, is that predictions are really hard, especially about the future. And that's exactly the boat we're in right now. We have this thing presented to us, this news item presented to us as a 10-year plan, and yet it's all contingent upon the actions of A, future Congresses, and B, the Fed in the future. How exactly this will all shake out, and we don't have the slightest idea how that's really going to happen. So
well, let's move on. Well, let's move on to structures and governance. To things that might be, if not easier to predict, at least somewhat different than saying nobody knows.
Right.
Back in 1787, Jimmy Madison and Company gave us a division of power between the President, the Senate, and the House that was identical to the then division of power between the British King, the British aristocracy, and the House of Lords, and the British Commons.
Yep.
Then, over the next century and a half, because the members of the House and Commons were kind of rich people in the countryside who didn't much rely on the government and who kept order through their own kind of tenants in their local neighborhoods, that it wasn't a big minus to the House of Commons if the government were to shut down for a month or, say, a year, say. And so over the next year and a half, the House of Commons grabbed so much power from the Senate and the Crown King to leave the monarch essentially a completely passive, symbolic opener of brand new projects, and the head of the majority party in the House of Commons, the elective dictator of the government of Britain. In the past week and a half, we have seen the president, who is supposed, since FDR, to be the dominant player of the U.S. government, get rolled in a manner never seen before by the Speaker of the House, who everyone said was not a guy who had much control over his caucus. That is, Boehner is out there saying that the policy preferences embodied in this compromise are 98% his and 2% Obama's and 0% Pelosi's, and as best as I can see, he is right. Does this mark a shift or a partial shift to a system in which the real head of government is the Speaker of the House?
It's a good question. I don't know. I think it's. I think probably not. I think that the fact that let's agree that the president got rolled. That is his ongoing insistence that there be new revenues in any compromise deal. Didn't happen.
Or even that there be something to try to do to deal with unemployment over the next 18 months.
Right. There's nothing in there on that account either.
Yeah. Originally, the White House's line to kind of people like me was that be quiet, progress on long-run deficit reduction is the road to action on unemployment in the short run.
Right.
Extension of the payroll tax cuts, Larry Summers Infrastructure Bank, et cetera, et cetera. And that ain't in there.
Yeah, right. So does that reflect some novel change in the structure of American governance, or does it simply reflect public opinion, which is Peter Beinart wrote an interesting column about this. There are two signal factors that underlie the politics of this deal. One, we had a grassroots small government movement, the Tea Party, in the wake of this economic calamity that we're that we've been in since 2008, but no corresponding progressive grassroots movements defending the current welfare state or pushing for greater government involvement to stimulate the economy. So as far as grassroots energy coming from the electorate, we've got a big asymmetry. Meanwhile, Beinart points out that even though we continue to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan and now Libya, the oomph behind the global war on terror has subsided considerably. We're looking for ways to get out of Afghanistan, and we're getting out of Iraq, and we've killed bin Laden. And as a result, there are an increasing number of conservatives who are no longer reflexive blank checkers to the Pentagon, who are more interested in cutting overall government spending than they are in defending Pentagon budgets. And therefore, the balance in the Republican Party between budget hawks and defense hawks has evaporated. Once upon a time, the power of the defense hawks allowed for more concessions on the domestic spending side to keep the spending to the Pentagon flowing. If that has changed now, you have an upper hand, the upper hand going to the Republican budget hawks, strengthened by this grassroots movement. And so the fundamental politics of America in 2011 are hostile to what Obama was trying to do, and that's why he didn't succeed.
As opposed to the reading that Obama was a status quo player who did not think he could afford to let the government shut down because he would be blamed, because he's the president and he's supposed to keep Washington under control.
Yeah, I think of course that is a factor, right? So that the president, fairly or not, gets credit when the economy is doing well, even if he didn't have much to do with it. Gets blamed for the economy doing poorly, even if he didn't have much to do with it. And so yes, he's the because he's left holding the bag. He has a sense of responsibility that's much more acute than other players in Washington. And in the game of chicken, you had plenty of people in the Republican caucus who were absolutely convincingly crazy. That is, that they were never going to move out of the middle of the road, and you either have to go to the ditch or you're going to have a head-on collision because they weren't going to move. There were plenty of people who didn't want to raise the debt ceiling at all, and were sort of licking their chops at the prospects of a default. And in the face of that, Obama did the responsible thing, but he didn't get his priorities included in the bill.
What does Obama do on September 30th, when the Republican majority in the House of Representatives has not yet passed the single appropriations bill, let alone a continuing resolution?
You tell me. What are his options?
The Tea Party demands the full and permanent extension of, say, all of the Bush tax cuts and the elimination of the estate tax in return for a 1-month continuing resolution. And then what does Obama do on, say, November 30th, when the 2-month continuing resolution he negotiated expires? And once again, the Tea Party demands what it didn't get before.
The Tea Party's capacity to make demands and have them be felt as forceful is that they have some backing in American public opinion, or at least that they don't arouse organized opposition from coming out of American public opinion. And right now, let me say that you can argue that the Tea Party got rolled too. That is, the debt ceiling was raised, contrary to their fervent hopes. We did avoid default, contrary to some of their fervent hopes. The spending restraint in the bill is 95% make-believe, as we've already discussed. So if they exercise the nuclear option, and this is what they get, a tiny bit of restraint followed by a bunch of hand-waving, then I'm not sure how potent a force they are either.
Except they didn't exercise the nuclear option. They threatened the nuclear option.
Right, they threatened it, but they. This was Cuba Missile Crisis-esque, right? We got down to the wire.
Yes.
And by their lights, they don't have a great deal to show for it.
And so this doesn't mean that Cantor doesn't come back saying Boehner has to get something real out of this next negotiation, which happens on September 30th, and then if no agreement is reached, the government is shut down on October 1st.
and then we'll see if that happens. We'll see how the shutdown plays politically. In '95, as you recall, the Republicans were eager to have the government shut down, and they thought the public would rally to their side, and in fact they got hammered. So we'll see what happens. If we come to that point, we'll see what happens.
But what we've seen more in the past week is that Obama thinks that even a partial shutdown hurts him, and the country perhaps much more than it hurts the Republicans. And how does the dynamic that led Obama to demand to abandon his demands for something about unemployment and for something about revenue increases in the most recent negotiation, how does that dynamic differ 2 months from now?
So what do you think he ought to do?
I tend to think that Bill Clinton handled this rather well. And that when you have a situation in which you have a player like the House of Representatives that must move first on say, essentially everything that has the purse powers that the British House of Commons has, then either you find some way of convincing them that a failure to reach agreement is worse for them than it is for you, which Clinton did in 1995, 1996, or you find some way around it, pointing out that the debt limit bill is inconsistent with the spending and tax bills Congress passed later, and it's a principle of law going back to Henry III, that if a later law contradicts an earlier one, the earlier one is deemed repealed, and the only other option would have been to default on the debt, and the Constitution says you can't do that. But this is what happened to the British Crown and to the British House of Lords over a century and a half. That each time the House of Commons really wanted something, the status quo players, the players whose younger sons were army officers and who knew people who were civil servants and actually needed the government to flow so they could continue to have their parties, were confronted with a House of Commons that was perfectly happy to shut down the government for a while and go home to their country estates. And by the eve of World War I, the king was telling the House of Lords to knuckle under, or he would create as many peers as necessary to make sure that what the Commons wanted passed the House of Lords. And it seems to me that as long as the president is a status quo player, and as long as a 60-vote majority in the Senate thinks they have good, cushy positions and do not benefit from chaos, then any House majority that doesn't think it has as much to lose as the other players is potentially in control of the government. And that Boehner is just now realizing this. And that the existence of a Tea Party on his right flank of his coalition, which genuinely has to be cosseted and brought around and genuinely doesn't fear chaos by Washington standards, is a major edge. Question is, how long will this last, and will it continue into future Congresses?
Yeah, so the big difference between then and now is the members of Commons could retire to their country estates. Members of the House of Representatives go home to their districts and face town hall meetings. And the question is, what kind of reception will they get? Now, in the last go-round, we avoided a shutdown. Maybe we had 45 minutes of shutdown or something like that. But we avoided it because both sides feared the political consequences of it. Both feared that they would get blamed for it. And there's very good reasons to think that, as it happened last time in '95, that Republicans would be blamed for a shutdown. The voters don't like the gridlock in Washington. They don't like this squabbling, even though they're responsible for it because of their incoherent views. But we'll talk about that later. Anyway, they don't like this spectacle. And the question is, who will they blame it for? Who will they blame it on? It's entirely plausible that they'll blame it on the Republicans, that they sense that the Republicans are ideologically disposed to like the idea of a government shutdown, so they may very well pin the blame on Republicans. And of course, there's lots of reasons to do that because the Republicans have been the aggressor in this game of chicken. So it could very well blow up in their faces. I don't know, but if it doesn't blow up in their faces, then ultimately that is the ultimate reason for the balance of forces. Is that if one side has the upper hand, it's because it has the upper hand with American public opinion.
No, but your line of reasoning suggests that Obama's optimal strategy this summer would be to have Tim Geithner send John Boehner a letter saying pass a clean debt ceiling increase, or on August 3rd, the Social Security checks and the congressional salary checks aren't going to go out because they don't have the money to cover them. Very much what Bob Rubin said to Gingrich in early 1996. And it is true that there were then calls for the impeachment of Bob Rubin on the floor of the Senate for making this threat. But, with that threat out there, a compromise not inimical to Clinton and Rubin's interests was quickly arrived at. As opposed to this time when, that threat was not made, when the only thing Geithner said was that a failure to raise the debt ceiling is inconceivable, and in which the outcome is 98% Boehner and 2% Obama. So you think the system is still largely working, and it's working because public opinion is substantially on the Republican side right now, as opposed to my belief that what we're seeing is something that may well be a more structural shift in how American governance works.
I think that in the short term, the Republicans have behaved irresponsibly to play this game of chicken, to manufacture a crisis, to put the soundness of U.S. debt at risk, to put the whole world economy at risk. I think all of that was blameworthy, and I think that the public opinion that is supporting the Republicans' moves is based on a lot of factual errors. There's the thinking that somehow or another government spending can be massively restrained without cutting out any of the things that typical Americans really like. That is, they like their Social Security and Social Security checks and Medicare benefits, and those cost a lot of money. They seem to like having a gigantic Pentagon that's bigger than all the other defense budgets of the world put together, or more or less.
Yes, it's amazing.
And so the idea that we can solve our long-term fiscal imbalance without any new revenues and without interrupting government programs that are highly popular, I think is extremely unrealistic. So the second part of the Republicans' sort of irresponsibility is regarding every corporate tax loophole, every tax expenditure as sacrosanct. I think is bad policy. So I'm not saying that the Republicans are right and they've got the mandate of heaven behind them as revealed by American public opinion, but the fact is that they're getting away with doing what they're doing because there isn't any countervailing force on the other side pushing back against them out of American public opinion. So that's where we are. We're in the middle of democratic politics, and democratic politics are frequently an ugly business run by irresponsible people, and that's what's happening. But the current episode is part of a much larger drama, which at least I would argue that we've for something like 3 decades now been in a political equilibrium where American public opinion wants more government than it's willing to pay for, and we've sort of fluctuate around, and during the 90s, thanks to extremely robust economy, and some discipline in Washington, we got the fiscal house more in order. But still, there was the looming catastrophe of the retirement of the baby boomers, aging of the population, and Social Security and Medicare ballooning costs. And we didn't deal with those in the 90s, and we didn't deal with those in the O's. And now we're approaching the wall. And so eventually something's going to have to give, as Herb Stein said. If something doesn't go on forever, if something can't go on forever, it won't. And this disequilibrium between the public's appetite for government and the public's willingness to pay for government is going to have to be resolved one way or another, either in the form of higher taxes or a scale back in government's commitments. And there's no way something this big and this fundamental is going to get worked out neatly and sort of technocratically. It's going to happen in a series of squabbles and spasms and fits and tantrums and blowouts and over the course of years. And we've just been through one of them, and we're going to go through a lot more, I'm afraid, before the whole thing is sorted out.
But that's a much more pessimistic read than you would have given 12 years ago.
Yeah, that's probably true.
All right. Well, let's do this again on September 30th. I'll either have to eat a lot of crow if the continuing resolution, there won't be actual appropriations bills, if the continuing resolution has been passed and appears to be relatively uncontroversial, or I'll be truly terrified.
Well, let's dwell a little bit more on the longer term, because I think, even though I think we're in the early going of trying to solve this disequilibrium, of trying to solve our long-term fiscal imbalance. But the early moves are interesting. So the big question all along in my mind has been, when push comes to shove, which way will we go? Is the public more attached to the current level and structure of government commitments, or is it more attached to its relatively low tax bill? And right now, it looks like all signs point to the fact that they're more attached to their low tax bill, right? We've got a lot more political energy behind tax cutters than we do behind tax raisers. The one thing you can say about politicians is they have they have a pretty good sense of what they have to do to get reelected. And right now, the Republicans don't seem to have any difficulty talking about really dramatically changing the structure of entitlement programs. They voted for the Ryan plan earlier this year, and they haven't paid a political price for doing that. However, the Democrats are pretty mealy-mouthed talking about new revenues and haven't fought very hard for it, and don't seem to have a lot of public support. Yes, the opinion polls suggest that people want to see new revenues in a compromise. But there isn't the grassroots energy behind that point of view. So right now it looks to me like we're drifting towards a resolution of this imbalance that's going to take the shape more of real structural changes in our entitlement programs than it is going to take the form of dramatic tax increases.
Well, that's what you hope, right? And that's what you think would be good policy.
That is what I think would be good. That is what I think would be good policy. I realize there are many more moves left to be played in the game.
There are reasons to think that it's good policy. But I think you're misreading the Republican Party. Remember, these are people who not just voted for the Ryan plan, but who also ran against the Democrats in 2010. Because what Obama wants to do is introduce big government and death panels into your Medicare.
I agree completely. And the whole senior Bill of Rights and so forth. Right.
Yeah, and the automatic triggers in the kind of latest deficit in the debt ceiling round. The automatic triggers say that if the Super Congress Committee of 12 doesn't reach an agreement that is then passed, then we whack defense spending.
Yep.
We also whack Medicare providers.
Yes.
We don't increase Medicare copays. We
Right.
don't reduce Medicare benefits.
Yep.
We don't do anything on the consumer side. Instead, we whack the doctors and the drug companies.
Yes.
And a Republican Party that is against death panels, against reductions in Medicare benefits, for tax cuts, and for cuts to healthcare providers. Well, first, if they succeed, then it's going to be a health system that will make the deficiencies of Britain's National Health Service look like a walk in the park.
Yeah.
And second, we may come to a world in the future in which every single doctor is the most extraordinary contributor to the Democratic Party you've ever seen. That there's a deep incoherence at the bottom of modern republicanism that I don't think is going to lead them in the direction that you think would be good policy.
No, so, granted, everything you just said is completely and totally accurate, and I was hastening to add that there are many more moves to be played in this game, and there is no indication at the present time, little indication at the present time that anybody in government is really serious about that the Republicans who talk the limited government game are serious about real structural changes in Medicare, that they absolutely demagogued the whole death panels issue in the lead up to 2010 elections. And you're right, the structure of the automatic cuts is one that that indicates a lack of seriousness about really doing what needs to be done, which is changing the program on the not on the provider side, but on the benefit side. But again, we haven't hit the wall yet. And all I was saying is that the early indicators are that there's more terror or more reticence about raising taxes than there is about talking about structural changes in the entitlement programs, and now talking about perhaps significant cuts in defense spending. So all of this could change, and once the real bite of structural changes in Medicare or Social Security gets in the public's head, we could have a very different reaction. But just early going, it looks like the people who want smaller government have public opinion at their back.
Although, well, there is a counterfactual world out there in which Obama, Reid, and Pelosi were considerably more cynical and said the Republicans didn't worry about making their Medicare drug benefit especially good policy or paid for. The Republicans didn't worry about making the tax cuts paid for.
Right.
We shouldn't worry about the Affordable Care Act. No. We should simply expand coverage and not worry about finding savings. We should do the Affordable Care Act without any future Medicare cuts or efficiencies whatsoever.
Call it the Unaffordable Care Act.
The Republicans. Yeah, call it the Unaffordable Care Act. And say, we'll kick the can down the road.
Yep.
And to their credit, the Democratic caucus would not go there.
Yeah, and they got nailed for it.
But if they had gone there, would Obama now have healthy or not a healthy, but at least a bare Democratic majority in the House? I gotta say, probably. And I gotta wonder about an electorate that is rewarding politicians who do the wrong things.
So the public likes free ice cream, and it appears to be free because of our capacity to push the bill off onto to future generations. But that capacity is being exhausted. So we'll determine how much ice. So eventually, we'll determine how much ice cream the public really wants to consume if it has to pay for it, and that question remains unanswered. But that's the big drama that's unfolding now, and that will unfold for, I think, some years to come.
Yes, but will you see any party in the future willing to enact policies that are fiscally responsible? After the way in which the Democrats got dinged for being fiscally responsible about the Affordable Care Act in 2010.
Yeah, I think so. As Winston Churchill said about Americans, that you can always count on them to do the right thing once they've exhausted all alternatives. I think that applies to democracies generally. And when the wolf is at the door and there is no alternative but fiscal responsibility, we will be fiscally responsible. The big question is can we be fiscally responsible, sort of, prudentially and before the fact, and current indications aren't very promising.
So this suggests America is turning into Argentina.
Don't know about
which
that.
Which is fiscally responsible only when... Yeah.
But I think it could very well be that we have to face that this is a big abstraction, that the budget deficits and the limited capacity of the United States to borrow, that those seem sort of wan and insubstantial compared to the lure of free ice cream here and now. So for those abstractions to become sufficiently salient that they knock people over the head and make ordinary voters sense their reality, is going to take either great statesmanship, that is, politicians who are dedicated to educating voters about the real choices they face as opposed to the apparent choices they think they face, or it's going to take just the brute facts of reality hammering down on their heads. And we haven't seen any great statesmanship, and the brute facts are falling out of the sky right now, and they'll hit us sooner or later.
The brute facts are 15% per year inflation and 25% per year interest rates. And those are brute facts not just in that they concentrate politicians' and voters' attention, but they are also brute facts that tend to make an economy poor, or at least relatively poor.
I'm in no way blasé or complacent about the possibility of a real economic crisis. I think it would be terrible, and I hope it can be avoided. But it might not be avoided. And so, in the 1970s, we faced high inflation and deep recessions and a real period of lousy economic performance. And it looked, this was my teenage years, and it looked entirely plausible that American democracy was broken and America's best days were behind it and things were cycling down the toilet. But there was sufficient capacity for renewal and reform in the American political system that lots of real changes were made in microeconomic policy and deregulation of transportation and energy and communications and finance in ways that I think were very salutary. Monetary policy was reconceived, and the real monetary roots of inflation were finally recognized. And so we had real improvements in economic policy and economic governance in the wake of years of economic crisis. So we may have to go through that kind of learning experience again.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay.
But it would be nice if we didn't have to, right? But but current indications coming out of Washington aren't that we have enlightened statesmen at the helm. So we may just have to learn it the hard way. Okay, Brad, should we get together later in the fall and see how this is all shaking out?
Let's do this September 30th.
Okay.
I'm either going to want to eat crow or I'm going to want to gloat.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to be gloating. I'm not predicting anything great is going to happen. Okay. But we'll try to get together then and see how things are going.
All right.
Nice talking to you.
Sounds
and look forward to keeping the conversation going.
Sure. Yep.
All right.
Okay. Thank you, and goodbye.